hearing of the Subcommittee on State and Foreign Operations of the Senate Appropriations Committee to order. The purpose of today's hearing is to hear testimony from 6 exceptionally experienced witnesses concerning 2 of the most urgent crises confronting our world today. The ongoing destruction of cities and the daily atrocities committed by Russian forces against defenseless Ukrainian civilians outrages and offends the sensibilities of all of us. But we should also be concerned, even alarmed, about the widening food security crisis that this needless and brutal war by Russia is causing for hundreds of millions far beyond Eastern Europe. Before the war began in Ukraine, more than 50 countries, including nations like Ethiopia, Sudan, Syria, Yemen, Afghanistan, were facing acute food shortages due to prolonged drought and conflict. And today their circumstances are markedly worse. As we'll hear from our first panel of 3 witnesses, the collapse of exports of grain and vegetable oil from Ukraine, combined with inflation and higher costs for fertilizer, fuel, and transportation, have caused commodity prices to skyrocket. Latest UN information says the total number of people hungry has increased to 273 million, more than doubling the number living in hunger in 2019. Millions are at risk of starvation. Some estimates are even higher. This food security crisis is compounded by a second ongoing global crisis, the COVID-19 pandemic, triggering complex humanitarian emergencies on several continents that threaten economic, social, and political stability. While the number of Americans hospitalized and dying from COVID has declined significantly after Omicron peaked in January, it is again rising sharply in a number of our states, and this pandemic is far from over with us. COVID-19, I'll remind you, originated halfway around the world, and we are no less vulnerable to this pandemic today from a global perspective than we were a year ago. Roughly 2/3 of Americans are fully vaccinated, but worldwide, billions are not. And they are concentrated mostly in countries where the virus continues to spread and in countries with weak or fragile public health systems that struggle to respond to this ongoing challenge. Global campaigns against HIV/AIDS, malaria, TB, polio, and other infectious diseases long led by American funds or initiative have stalled or lost ground. And there is a very real risk to our nation and the world that new COVID variants will emerge overseas, causing a sudden resurgence of potentially deadly infections. That might force another lockdown that would threaten to once again shutter businesses, schools, public transportation, and government offices. If we can increase global vaccine coverage, we can dramatically reduce the spread of the virus and the incidence of new variants, protecting everyone, including Americans. As we consider our president's request for emergency supplemental military and humanitarian assistance for Ukraine and other countries impacted by the food crisis in Ukraine, our challenge is determining how the United States can best respond to these interrelated global challenges. The President's request initially included about $1.8 billion for food aid, which in my view fell far short of what is urgently needed. Senator Graham and I have both called for at least $5 billion, and I am optimistic, given the action in the House last night, that that amount will be in the final supplemental. The President's request for $5 billion in emergency funding for global COVID response was submitted in March and has not yet been acted on by this Congress. As the Appropriations Subcommittee responsible for providing the relevant funding, we're looking to our 6 witnesses this afternoon to help us understand what the COVID virus is doing, what we should most be concerned about, how their organizations and other donors are responding, and their recommendations so we can make the strongest case to our colleagues in the Senate. Any successful global response against the COVID pandemic requires United States leadership and resources. I also want to emphasize in closing that we are in a critical global strategic situation as well, because dozens of countries and millions of people were forced to rely on Chinese and Russian vaccines, which have ultimately proven ineffective against the Omicron variant. We have an opportunity, 20 years after the PEPFAR program was launched, to once again demonstrate that the United States is a reliable global public health partner, and we should take that chance. Before introducing the first panel, I'll turn to my ranking member and wanted to express my gratitude to my colleague, Senator Graham, who has been a strong partner and advocate for additional funding to address both these crises. For any opening remarks you'd care to make.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it very much. I think the committee has done a good job working together, and One of our witnesses is South Carolinian, David. We're very proud of you at home, former governor of South Carolina and the leader of the World Food Program. Thank you, ma'am, for coming very much. Our second witness here. The bottom line is if you believe in a strong national security to keep America safe, then you have to be involved in world hunger. Because you'll hear from David here pretty soon, the number of people that are in a desperate strait that will lead to mass migration, that will start the cycle all over again. There's so many conflicts on the globe, it's hard to keep up with them. Then you've got COVID on top of that. The amount of money that will be in the supplemental is about $5 billion. That's a lot more than requested, but still not enough. And to the American people, what does it matter? Well, if somebody's starving over there, they're not going to just sit around and starve. They are very vulnerable to terrorist recruitment. Spent a lot of time in Afghanistan doing some reserve duty in prisons, and there were a lot of ideological-driven terrorists, but a lot of people wound up in prison because they couldn't feed their family, and $500 sounded pretty good, and that's why they plant the IED. The ability of terrorists to recruit and sell their cause goes up exponentially as people looking for a way to feed their families. And the downside to famine and hunger is so enormous that the amount of money that we're spending, I think, is inadequate to the task, but we shouldn't be the only group spending the money. The GCC nations need to do more. The European Union needs to do more. But the American taxpayer, I think it is in your interest and our interest that we deal with this hunger problem, not only just from a moral point of view, but from a national security perspective. One last thought, and we'll get to the witnesses. We have a global fund that did a terrific job dealing with AIDS and malaria and disease. I'd like the committee to think about creating a global fund for food security to get a new line of revenue from the private sector. We'll put money in, but other countries have to match. Have a multinational approach to food security and get more involvement with the private sector. Elon Musk has gotten a lot of attention lately. He's one of the world's richest people, and he said he was asked to give $1 billion, I think, to the World Food Program or some cause, and he said, well, tell me how $1 billion will solve world hunger. It won't, but $1 billion that can be leveraged to get more money from other people goes a long way to providing the gap in funding that exists today. And Ambassador McCain, who works with David Beasley, they're in the same line of effort here, has got lots of plans to teach people to farm and to bring new farming practices to bear so people can feed themselves. The World Food Program is a result of people not having food available in their own backyard. The goal is to get them through the crisis and create a backyard that has food. If you don't understand after 9/11 how important dealing with hunger and poverty and the abuse of women is in this war, you have missed a lot. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Graham. Our first panel of 3 witnesses will focus on food security. We are very fortunate to have 3 witnesses whose combined experience in this field is unmatched. First will be the Honorable David Beasley, Executive Director of the World Food Program, an organization that won the Nobel Prize in 2020. Ms. Cheda Dioen McKenna is Chief Executive Officer of Mercy Corps, a well-regarded global humanitarian relief organization. And Dr. Akinwume Adesina is President of the African Development Bank. President Adesina is in Accra, Ghana, and will be testifying remotely. I had the honor of visiting with Dr. Adesina in Accra a number of years ago, and his leadership of the African Development Bank is very widely regarded. We welcome each of you. I'd ask you make opening remarks of up to 6 minutes, and your full written testimony will be included in the hearing record. Members will then have 6-minute rounds for questioning. Director Beasley, if you would please lead off, followed by Ms. McKenna and Dr. Adesina. Thank you.
Senator, thank you very much, and it's an absolute honor to be here. And I know Democrats and Republicans fight on a lot of things, but when it comes to strategic international aid on food security, it's quite a remarkable thing to see everyone come together, recognizing the catastrophe that we are facing. Because as you said, and Senator Graham, as you said, if you don't have food security, you're not going to have any other security. And we've seen that firsthand. I've been out in the field And I've heard this many times over, particularly where ISIS and Al-Qaeda and extremist groups are, where women would say, Mr. Beasley, my son, my husband did not want to join ISIS or Al-Qaeda or this extremist group, but we hadn't fed our little girl in 2 weeks. What were we supposed to do? And so if you're not going to respond out of the goodness of your heart, because I tell friends around the world say, why should I send money down to Chad or Niger or Nicaragua when we got issues at home? I said, well, it's going to cost you 1,000 times more if you don't address the root cause and get ahead of it quickly. And I can give the mathematics experientially what we're talking about, because when we're not there, and if you're not going to do it out of the goodness of your heart, you better do it out of your national security interest. What we're already seeing, for example, in Central America from just 1 year ago, when you feed 125 million people like we do on any given day, week, or month, we survey a lot of people. We know what they're thinking. We watch their patterns. 5 times the number of people are already talking about migrating from Central America to the United States. And the Washington Post did an article that said on the children that end up at the border in the shelters, it was something like $3,750 per child per week. For $1 to $2 per week, we can stabilize the environment in Guatemala or Honduras or Nicaragua or El Salvador. The math is simple. Germany just did a study from the Syrian crisis, which is ongoing. They had 1 million refugees. We can feed a Syrian in Syria for 50 cents. That same Syrian ends up in Berlin, $70 per day, $125 billion. Divide that by 140, and you'll get the cost of what we could have done inside Syria. And we surveyed Syrians left and right. And what was the response? They did not want to leave home. But when they didn't have food security, they would actually move on average 3 to 4 times inside their country before they had no other alternative. When they couldn't feed their family and no degree of security, they did what any mother, any father would do in any country around the planet. When I arrived at this job 5 years ago, there were 80 million people marching towards starvation. There were 650 million that were chronically hungry. That number is now up to 810. It's going to be going higher now. But that 80 million, those 80 million that are acutely food insecure, I thought we could eliminate that. I was hoping to put the World Food Program out of business, that we would no longer be needed. We ended hunger and created sustainability and resilience. But we had man-made conflict, one after the other, and climate shocks. And that number went from 80 million to 135 million right before COVID. COVID comes along, that number went from 135 to 276 million people marching towards starvation. This is pre-Ukraine now. And out of that 276 million, you have 48 million of them that are knocking on famine's door in 43 countries. So I can tell you which 43 countries are vulnerable to famine, destabilization, and mass migration by necessity. And we have an answer to that, and that's food. If we get the resources we need, just like we did over the last 2 years, even with COVID economic rippling effect, we were able to avert famine and destabilization and mass migration because the United States government responded, along with countries like Germany that stepped up and others. But we have many other countries now that need to step up, and especially with oil prices, the Gulf states need to step up in a way they've never done before. At least if they would pick up the price tag for humanitarian funds of need in their own neighborhood. So just when you think it can't get any worse, Ethiopia, then Afghanistan, and then, of course, Ukraine. Why is Ukraine troubling? Because it's the breadbasket of the world. They grow enough food to feed 400 million people. That's gone. The ripple effect of that around the world, 26 nations alone depend on 50% or more of their grain from that region. The silos are full. Why are the silos full? Because the ports are blocked. Why are the ports blocked? Because Russian forces. The farmers need to harvest again in July and August. July and August, where are they? They're on the front lines. They need to be putting out pesticides and fertilizers. Even if they do get a harvest, of which we expect maybe half the yield, where's it going to go? If the ports aren't open, the global ripple effect will be famines around the world. And this is why it's critical and so much appreciated that the United States, the Senate and the House, is responding in such a time as this. But we've got to get those ports open. We've got to get the resources we're talking about out into the field quickly, into the countries that are going to be very vulnerable in the Sahel and Eastern Africa and the Middle East and Central America, and I can go on and on. But if we get the resources that you are now talking about appropriated, it will go a long way in stabilizing nations around the world, which the American taxpayer will save money because you won't have famine and destabilization and mass migration. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Beasley. Ms. McKenna.
Thank you. Good afternoon. And thank you, Subcommittee Chair Coons, Ranking Member Graham, and members of this committee. I want to express my gratitude for convening this hearing on rising global food insecurity, a problem that was already acute, but that has already deepened dramatically in recent months. My name is Jada Doyen McKenna. I am the CEO of Mercy Corps. We are an international humanitarian and development and peace-building organization. We operate in 40 fragile countries facing conflict and hunger, supporting more than 37 million people. I previously stood up and ran the U.S. government's Feed the Future initiative at USAID in response to the last global food crisis. And I know how critical it is to respond to immediate hunger crises while strengthening food systems and building long-term resilience. A perfect storm is leading to heightened global food insecurity, worse, much worse than the previous food crises over the past decade. Food and fuel price hikes resulting from the war in the Ukraine are the latest shock undercutting the ability of the poorest and most vulnerable to feed themselves. The deepening effects of climate change, conflict in other parts of the world, and the economic pummeling of the COVID-19 pandemic combined to push those least able to cope towards the abyss of hunger before the shockwaves caused by Ukraine. I testified last year in front of the House Foreign Affairs Committee that COVID-19 was burdening people's ability to feed themselves through the loss of income and global supply chain disruptions, and those words continue to ring true. COVID-19 was not only a health crisis, it is a food and socioeconomic crisis as well, one which rolled back decades of hard-won poverty reduction and food security gains and continues to do so today. The drought unfolding in the Horn of Africa is a prime example of the devastation wrought by a second hunger driver, climate change. The region is experiencing its third drought in just a decade. The current one is the most devastating in a generation, with over 15 million people experiencing extreme hunger, a 70% increase in comparison to past severe droughts. In Somalia, a recent famine risk assessment clearly signals the potential for widespread malnutrition and starvation, with 81,000 people already in famine-like conditions and over 1.7 million on the brink. Additional projections indicate the lives of 350,000 children are at risk. The dual challenges of COVID-19 and climate shocks are now being compounded by conflict. While the war in Ukraine is responsible for food, fuel, and fertilizer price hikes, it is not the only conflict undercutting people's ability to feed themselves. Conflicts in the Sahel, Somalia, Syria, and Yemen have decimated food systems, destroyed livelihoods, and led to widespread hunger. As my colleague Mr. Beasley said, several of the most fragile countries reliant on Ukrainian imports find themselves in serious trouble. The prices of wheat, corn, and oil and cooking oil across Africa and the Middle East are rising sharply. I recently traveled to Lebanon just after visiting Poland to visit the Ukrainian border. I saw that the price of some basic food items were increased already within 3 weeks of the conflict started. In Somalia, basic food items have increased by over 100%. Lebanon, where I was, which imported 81% of its wheat from Ukraine, faces the fallout from the grain shortages and higher commodities It continues to host a very large Syrian refugee population and is still reeling from the Beirut port blast, with a growing proportion of the population already relying on subsidized wheat. There is increasing risk that higher fuel and food prices could drive social tensions, instability, and protest. The global price of wheat has never been higher, eclipsing the last highest price, which was just prior to the Arab Spring, which threatened regional stability in the Middle East. While this perfect storm may appear unique, it is a window into the types of multi-factor challenges we face if conflict goes unchecked, climate impacts increase, and new health security challenges unfold. In order to tackle this current crisis, Mercy Corps urges Congress to specifically increase humanitarian and food security funding this year. Organizations on the front lines estimate that an additional $5 billion will be needed for the U.S. to tackle. I know that you all agree, so I will leave that. Mercy Corps also recommends that the U.S. government double down on efforts to mitigate future food insecurity through a series of critical actions. First, we recommend that the U.S. government urgently make humanitarian aid smarter by prioritizing the use of flexible cash and voucher programs complemented by actions to sustain local markets. Second, we recommend scaling resilient food systems by doubling investments in Feed the Future countries to shock-proof those communities. And lastly, we recommend tackling the root causes of hunger by significantly increasing investments in peace building and conflict prevention in fragile contexts, reinvigorating the coordination of the R3 bureaus at USAID, and finally, appropriately layering and sequencing both humanitarian and development interventions for better outcomes. We must not only act to address immediate food security situations, but also to insulate communities to help withstand future shocks that will be costly in both human resources and human lives lost unnecessarily. The U.S. government exercised leadership in the wake of the last crisis in standing up Feed the Future. We encourage an equally bold and even bolder, because the situation is so much worse than the last one, to address the drivers of the current crisis and build resilience. Otherwise, I fear food aid needs will continue to grow, and we will continue to have to hold hearings like this every 5, 10, 15 years if we don't act now. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Adesina.
Thank you very much, Chairman, Senator Chris Coons. It was great to have you visit us in Abidjan. It's nice to see you again. Ranking Member Senator Lindsey Graham, it was also great to see you in Abidjan when you visited. Distinguished members of the U.S. Senate Appropriations Subcommittee on State and Foreign Operations, and I hope I will have the opportunity to welcome several of you also to the headquarters of the African Development Bank that is based in Abidjan. I very much appreciate the opportunity to testify about the U.S. response and policy options for global food security crisis. I have dedicated my professional life to realizing Africa's potential through development. I have served Africa's most populous nation as Nigeria's agriculture minister. And I am president of the African Development Bank Group, Africa's premier and most trusted development finance institution. And I am also the 2017 World Food Prize winner. So I like things about food. With an active portfolio of $60.35 billion in more than 140,000 locations, the African Development Bank is Africa's only AAA-rated financial institution. Our strategic high-five priorities are to light up and power Africa, feed Africa, industrialize Africa, integrate Africa, as well as improve the quality of life of the people of Africa. Today, I would like to focus on feeding Africa and what the African Development Bank is doing to address the global food crisis. Africa has an estimated 33 million smallholder farms. They are key to food production and the livelihoods of millions of more Africans whose work and lives are linked to the agricultural sector. The truth is, with America's financing and those of other 80 shareholder members of the bank, the African Development Bank's group actions to boost harvests from Africa's farms are achieving impressive results. For example, Through our Technologies for African Agricultural Transformation, which we call TAAT or TART, our support reached 11 million farmers in 28 countries in little over 2 years. The program is delivering climate-smart seeds, fertilizers, and technical support, allowing farmers to harvest higher yields of wheat, corn, rice, and other staples. African food production, as a result of those efforts, has increased by more than 12 million metric tons. The economic shocks from the Russian war in Ukraine are causing all of us to pay more to put food on the table. The magnitude of food price increases and trade disruptions caused by the Russian-Ukraine conflict have hit Africa harder than other developing regions of the world, threatening to topple the continent's food systems already stressed by the COVID-19 pandemic. Africa must prepare for the inevitable global food crisis. Ukraine exports 40% of its wheat and corn to Africa. According to the United Nations, 15 African countries import more than half of their wheat and as much of their fertilizers and oil from Ukraine and Russia. As the Russian-Ukraine conflict rages, Africa is also dealing with a 30 million metric ton loss of wheat and corn that won't be coming from Russia nor from Ukraine. The cost of bread is now beyond the reach of many Africans. The Russian-Ukraine conflict is a huge factor in fertilizer prices hiking upwards of 300%. Our analysis is that Africa faces a fertilizer shortage of 2 million metric tons this year. We estimate it will cost about $2 billion at current market prices to source new fertilizer to cover the gap. If we don't mitigate this shortage rapidly, food production will decline by at least 20%, and we estimate in many places by more than 50% as well. This horrific perfect storm will see Africa lose more than $11 billion in the value of food production, according to our analysis. Without urgent and immediate global action, we may witness social and political unrest, as we have seen only too often in the past, as we heard from Senator Graham and also Senator Kroon. The truth is that the African Development Bank, with your support, is prepared to meet this challenge and others head on. Let me share what we are doing to help avert a looming food crisis. We have developed an Africa Emergency Food Production Plan. Our $1.5 billion plan will be used to support African countries to produce food rapidly, produce 38 million metric tons of food, in fact. The total value of the additional food production is $12 billion US. The Africa Emergency Food Production Plan will deliver climate-resilient agricultural technologies to 20 million farmers. Majority of those will be women farmers. The $1.5 billion plan intends to source $1.3 billion of our own resources, with U.S. government support to reduce the $200 million financing gap. We can ensure the Africa Emergency Food Production Plan's success. Distinguished members of the subcommittee, we are spearheading efforts for African solutions to Africa's immediate, medium, and long-term challenges. The strong support of the U.S. for our Africa Emergency Food Production Plan will allow Africa to avert the looming food crisis and use the opportunity to drive structural changes in agriculture to unleash the full potential of Africa to become a breadbasket to the world. Thank you very much for the invitation.
Thank you, Dr. Adesina. Thank you, Ms. McKenna and Mr. Beasley. My colleague had a quick comment he wanted to make before we proceed.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, we had a huge bipartisan vote last night in the House I'm hoping we can pass this week, and there'll be $5 billion roughly in the package to help the problems identified by our witnesses. And Governor Beasley's advocacy has been huge. But I just want to recognize Senator Blunt. He's the conference chairman on the Republican side. He's made this a top issue for the conference for the last 3 or 4 weeks. He laid the groundwork better than anyone, quite frankly, about why we need to think about paying now or pay later. Governor Beasley was at the conference yesterday. So, Roy, I just want to let people know that we would not be here on our side without you, and I appreciate your leadership.
Thank you, Senator.
As a seasoned senior appropriator and a widely respected colleague, I look forward to your engagement both on this Ukraine supplemental and on figuring out a path forward on COVID internationally, domestically. And I also want to thank you for your friendship and leadership, Senator Blunt. We've only got 6 minutes, so I'll try and touch on a few main issues. Across all three of your testimony, it seems clear this is one of the worst food crises in the world in decades, certainly in the lifetime of any of us. I'd be interested in how you think we can best maximize the effectiveness of our response. You've made references to resiliency, to investing in smallholder farmers, to bringing to market climate-resilient seeds, to unblocking access to the capabilities of Ukraine. I'd be interested in each of the three of you would simply talk to, given that we may well have a $5 billion additional contribution from the United States if and when we pass this Ukraine supplemental, how do we make it as flexible, responsive, and effective as possible? Please, first, Mr. Beasley.
Senator, thank you. And I had a limited time, but first thing is get the money out the door as fast as we can because we do have a crisis. We are already cutting millions upon millions of beneficiaries down to 50%. Like in Yemen, 8 million have been cut down to 50%. In the Sahel region, Mali, Burkina Faso, Chad, and those are areas that you'll have destabilization and mass migration. It'll be absolute catastrophic consequences. And so we need to move fast. We need to make certain that USAID is encouraged to move the resources out as quickly as possible. And we've got means and mechanisms to do that. I think what we're facing right now is a short-term crisis and phenomenon. Now, we do need to talk about the long-term of resilience and sustainability because we have solutions on that too. But right now, the house is burning down. We've got to make certain that we put the fire out before the entire world's on fire. And that's where we are. So, and just by the way, just our operational cost increase is $71 million more per month because of food price increases, fuel price increases, as well as shipping costs. And what we're facing right now in the next 8 to 12 months is a food pricing problem, which creates access issues for those who can't afford it, which is critical. But next year, because of the fertilizer and the droughts, we could have a food availability problem next year. And so we got a lot of work to do, and we got to move fast. And I think that's critical to stabilize the countries that we are concerned at risk.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Ms. McKenna, resiliency.
Yes.
Future, long-term, what should we be doing?
It
we have to address a crisis, but what else should we be doing?
Exactly. It would be a grave mistake if USAID were to err and put 95 or most of the money in the current food, although obviously we need the current commodities. Based on research that we've done in the Horn of Africa, we've seen that investments in resilience building are estimated to save $4.3 billion over a 15-year period. So that averages to about $287 million per year. And what does that look like? That looks like the long-term layering of longer-term assistance and mechanisms while doing the humanitarian assistance. So humanitarian assistance that helps to build and support local markets like cash and flexible vouchers, support to entrepreneurs to do import substitution or other things needed to kind of keep people in place, programs that support youth to help prevent them from being recruited into conflict, things that promote governments and their own fiscal stability to provide safety nets so that doesn't further impair social cohesion. So we would love to see more of this long-term comprehensive focus on building systems, more coordination between those three bureaus around conflict, more support to conflict prevention actors, and social cohesion and the fighting of misinformation. We've got a food, climate, conflict, they all go together. It's a circle. So we really making sure that USAID is thinking about this comprehensively is critical, and with the lens particularly on conflict-affected countries. It's critical.
Thank you, Ms. McKenna. Dr. Adesina.
Thank you very much, City Senator. Firstly, I think, as Senator Graham was saying in his introductory remarks, if people can't produce food in their backyard, they really have absolutely no resilience at all. So the first thing to do is to make sure that people can actually produce the food that they're actually going to grow for their families without having to check out a bowl and beg for food. So I think the first thing for building resilience is support people, smallholder farmers, to produce the food and decouple them from such effects that happen so often. The second is we got to also focus a lot on making sure that we can leverage resources. It's fantastic to really hear what board ranking members have said about $5 billion, but that can be leveraged a lot. And I think international, multilateral financial institutions like ourselves can use some of those monies and actually leverage them significantly. So leveraging matters, as you actually said, Senator Kuhn, in your introductory remarks. I think that whatever we do to ensure effectiveness and efficiencies, the private sector is critical. Governments are going to have to play a role, yes, in terms of support, but we've got to make sure that whatever support is provided does not undermine the private sector, but rather promotes and enhances and facilitates the private sector in input markets, in financial markets, and in logistics and getting food out to markets. I think we also have to make sure that targeting is done in such a way that those who actually need this support for seeds and fertilizers get it. Most of those are actually women, smallholder farmers. And so targeting that, I would say it's very important, and digital technologies can play a role in that. And finally, it's at the end of the day, as you all said in the beginning, board ranking members, the issue of fragility, it's important. Many of these countries, and my other colleagues have already said it, in the Sahel, in the Horn of Africa, where we are having what I call a disaster triangle that has to do with very high structural poverty, high levels of unemployment, and environmental and social environmental degradation makes these areas so highly vulnerable. So I think that we should target quite a lot of support to make sure we can stabilize these particular areas.
Thank you to all three of you. I agree that we need to move swiftly. We need to be flexible in how we deliver this aid, how it partners between the private sector, multilateral development banks, nonprofit partners, and the largest agencies and entities like the World Food Program and USAID. I look forward to hearing more of your testimony. Senator Graham.
Thank you. Governor Beasley, the demand for your product is going through the roof. Is that correct?
Yes, sir. In fact, we are 50% of the resources we need. We now, because of all the crises that we're talking about, from conflict to climate to COVID, and now Ukraine, we are about $10 billion short of what we need.
Okay, so this $5 billion, we're appropriators, so I'm not much of a farmer, but I want to help people help themselves. That's the whole point of this hearing. The $5 billion helps, but it's not enough by itself.
That's correct.
Okay, what I want to know is, what did the GCC nations give to causes like this?
This year has not been much compared to what the United States.
So every time you go to the gas pump, these folks are getting rich. They're our allies in problem areas too. But so I want the subcommittee not only to fill in the gap that Governor Beasley has with American taxpayer dollars. I want us as a group, Mr. Chairman, to call in our allies and say, you need to help too. In terms of Europe, how do they do?
Germany has really stepped up compared to where they were. About 7 or 8 years ago, they were at 350 million. Now they're at 1.4 billion. I've spoken to the Bundestag on a number of occasions.
What about the European Union?
The European
represents
Union,
all of Europe.
in my opinion, has stepped up, but it can do more.
Do you know what they give?
To us, it's about $500 to $600 million.
Okay, now they're the same amount of people as the United States. So
Correct.
We're going to visit these other groups. I'm going to make an argument to the American taxpayer. We need to spend this money and spend it now for the reasons you said. But I promised the American taxpayer we're going to rattle some cages. So to the president of our African bank, You've been very impressive in your presentation. How has COVID hurt the economy in Africa?
Well, thank you very much, distinguished Senator. COVID situation is really hurt Africa quite a lot. Of course, economic growth rates actually declined by roughly 1.5% as a result of that, the lockdowns, and you couldn't get trade going and all of that. And we had roughly about 26 million people that fell further into poverty as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. And roughly 30 million people actually lost their jobs. So the impact is beyond just the amount of disease of people that actually died from it. So that's the impact. But in the recovery of Africa for that, it's been rather muted compared to the other parts of the world. We project that economies will probably grow back about 5.1%. But the real issue is how do we ensure that we don't have a divergence in the growth rates of the developed countries and the developing countries such as Africa. The big issue there is access to vaccines. And as you know, right now we have only 16% of Africa's population is actually vaccinated, fully vaccinated. And if you look at that compared to developed economies, countries in the world, Australia is about 83%. If you look at the United States, you're so high here. You look at Europe, well over almost 70%. So the issue is access to vaccine. A lot of work is being done, distinguished Senator, in terms of local manufacturing of vaccines in Africa. That ought to be promoted. But I do think that we got to make sure that we prepare not only for this particular COVID situation, but we build what I call Africa Healthcare Defense System, which will have to be predicated on three factors, three areas. One is build Africa's pharmaceutical industry, which is very critical. We import over 80-90% of pharmaceutical products in Africa, which is not acceptable. The second thing is to make sure we build local vaccine manufacturing capacity. And third one, and most critical, is the issue of health infrastructure, primary healthcare, secondary healthcare, and tertiary healthcare, especially also diagnostic infrastructure. I know that when you came, Senator Graham, to Abidjan, and we had a conversation over dinner, the whole issue was around infrastructure. And this is one area of infrastructure that we think is critical, infrastructure for life.
Well, one of the things I learned on the trip from the Gates Foundation, there was a single mother, I think, with 4 daughters, and where the power lines go, everything changes. As you build the road and build the power system, you can get products to market better. Drought-resistant seeds were used by this by this young woman, and her yields were 10 times what they were before because she was using technology. They moved the cow out of the house into its own place, and that improved the healthcare environment. They were able to get some disposable income and didn't have to walk 5 or 6 miles a day to get water. So, infrastructure really is important to economic development, particularly on the food side. Ms. McKenna, the Global Fund has been, I think, a good success
Yes.
where money has been matched. Do you see a need for something like that in the food security space?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Multilateral action is key. And what is concerning is that we have seen some countries kind of take away aid from places like Yemen or Syria in order to support responses in the Ukraine. And the answer is more, including private sector and other motivations. It's not less or moving it around.
Senator, can I add real quick? I pulled up the two numbers on like Saudi Arabia and UAE. 3 years ago, we received from both those countries $658 million, primarily in Yemen. This year, we've received $6 million from Saudi Arabia and $0 from UAE.
Wow. Thank you. That may change next week.
Thank you, sir.
Look forward to the persuasive effort. Senator Durbin.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the witnesses and all of you here today for this critically important hearing. I'm going to ask some questions that may be a little bit different. When we talk about food and feeding people, most of us think in terms of raw foodstuffs, and I'd like to be more specific. In areas of famine, I've seen, and this goes back a few years, I don't know if this is still the case, the use of food supplements like Plumpy Nut. Is that still out there?
Therapeutic.
It's a winner, isn't it?
Super Plumpy Nut
and also rehydration therapies. When we talk about food aid through your agencies and such, does it include these things?
Yes, sir. In fact, there's been a deliberate effort and a substantial improvement in not just calories, but the right calories and nutritional added value products. And that's one of the things that we're really working together more strategically than we were years ago.
When we hear about the increasing cost of local food producers, I think of how we might help them directly, but I also think indirectly. Are there microcredit programs that are part of your effort so that local farmers can borrow some money to get through the tough time?
Senator, we think that this is a very critical part of the success going forward, not nearly enough. One of the things that Congress has done in the last few years is given us more flexibility with funding. So we now do $2 billion in cash-based transfers, which puts liquidity into the local economies, which stimulates the local smallholder farmers. And we're also now buying internally, like for Africa, to stimulate farming operations in that regard as well as we're bringing, obviously, tremendous amount of quantity of commodities from the United States into the countries that are in great need. But these resilience programs are the long-term success. The charity is never going to be the final solution, as you well know. It's got to be, we've got to create an incentive such that you have water harvesting and all the things that you create the resilience. Because in many of these countries we're struggling with right now because of this shock from Ukraine, if we could go in with the right programs and scale them up, then they won't have these shocks like we're experiencing. And that'll save a lot of money, Senator.
May I add, Senator, in addition to microcredit, which can be difficult sometimes for agricultural producers to make the frequent payments it requires, we also have looked at things like microinsurance to kind of help protect against crop failures, things like different micro savings products to help them plan better. So comprehensive financial tools are part of the services that we offer.
We know that COVID.
Sorry, Distinguished Senator, may I come in?
Sure.
Sorry to.
Go ahead.
Thank you. I just wanted to make quick points about what you said about the importance of malnutrition. We should make sure that in the interventions that we do, it's not just calories that matter. It's actually nutritious food that's also very, very important. So, because at the end of the day, if you have children that are stunted and they're not getting the right kind of nutrients, it affects actually the capacity of the brain to function well. So, what I call gray matter infrastructure. We've got to really build that into this. And one of the things that we will be supporting through this emergency food production plan is the whole area of bio-fortified foods. So what I highlight in maize, what I eat sorghum that is actually fortified with iron or beans and things like that are also fortified. It's very important. Our nutritional supplementation is important. Now, one thing I just wanted to say is how important these interventions are. We have a program that we're doing in the Sagota area, which is in Ethiopia, which is in the Tigray area. In fact, as bad as things were in that area, the percentage of kids that were actually stunted was as high as 50-60%. We brought it down to about 38% in a very short period of time. So these focused production things that are targeted with high nutrient foods does make the difference very quickly. And on the point of the microcredit that you said, I think at the end of the day, it comes back to what Senator Coons was saying. We've got to make sure the $5 billion that we're talking about here is used to also leverage financial institutions. Banks don't lend to agriculture in most cases because of high perceived risk. But when I was Minister of Agriculture, I got the banks in Nigeria to actually lend to agriculture, put together a $350 million risk guarantee facility for them if they lost their money. And we ran it. We leveraged over $3.5 billion from the banks into agriculture. And non-performing loans, less than 1%. So which means that the perceived risk is excessively high. And so we at the bank, as part of our intervention, are looking into how we are going to use risk mitigating factors and risk guarantees to leverage the capital of the balance sheet of those banks, going to seed companies, fertilizer companies, logistics, and all of those actors in the agricultural value chain. This is very, very important.
Thank you, sir. I want to ask one last question, if I can, and it relates to COVID-19. We all know the death toll in the United States has reached 1 million, maybe 6 million worldwide. The U.S. has developed very effective vaccines, but we have struggled to supply them to the rest of the world. And now we have a greater challenge in poor countries than just providing vaccine. We have weak health infrastructures in those countries, vaccine hesitancy, and other competing basic health demands. A member of my staff went to West Africa, and I asked him specifically to look at COVID-19 vaccine supplies. He reported a surplus of vaccines, but not enough demand. There is a hesitancy involved in it. There's a lack of infrastructure to deliver it, and that has to be part of our conversation. So it isn't just the value of the vaccine, it's taking with it the means of delivery. Can anyone on the panel comment on that aspect?
Senator, when most of the airline industry shut down during the height of COVID, the World Food Program stepped up and began delivering COVID supplies from PPE, testing equipment, ventilators, the whole 9 yards into 183 countries. So someone said that we were actually the world's largest operating airline at one time. That's something that you aren't really proud of, but when the airline industry shut down, we had to do what we needed to do. When it came to vaccines, we are and are prepared to step up and deliver and take advantage of our logistics supply chain, because we were really very good at it, but we've really not been asked to do that much in the supply chain of vaccines. We've had a very little role in that.
I would like to echo that. NGO partners like Mercy Corps and our peers, we are your last mile partners. We are in these deep communities that are difficult to reach with deep, long-standing relationships. And we reached out several times, kind of trying to get people to work with us to support that last mile delivery. And it just was not something that was taken up in a huge way.
Yeah. For Africa, if I may, Distinguished Senator, the issue with the vaccine hesitancy that you mentioned, yes, there is some truth to that. But I will not say that there is surplus of vaccines in Africa. In fact, what happens is that it's not enough supply. We have even all of what's supposed to be delivered to Africa wasn't really delivered. It came late. Some of them were actually expired vaccines, so they couldn't really be, doses couldn't really be applied. And you have a situation in which, as developed countries actually had double doses, triple doses, and booster shots, Africa was just basically still struggling to have basic shots. So I do think that it is not necessarily correct to think that there is a surplus of vaccines in Africa. There is not a surplus of vaccines in Africa. There are structural issues that we must deal with in terms of making sure that we have the capacity to produce those vaccines in Africa, and also issues that have to do with intellectual property rights that can make sure some of those vaccines and antigens and things like that are needed are actually available to the R&D systems in the local pharmaceutical and vaccine manufacturing industry. So in Africa right now, a lot is being done in terms of Johnson & Johnson in South Africa and many other places to set up vaccines manufacturing. And when they are setting up those vaccine manufacturing, it's because there is demand, but they're trying to deal with the problem of structural bottlenecks that have made it difficult for Africa to actually access the vaccines in the quantity, at the cost, and at the timing that is needed.
Thank you. We have votes on, so Senator Blunt, and I'm going to go vote, and we'll do the best we can.
Thank you.
All right, that means I'm in charge until you get back.
You're in charge.
Well,
For a while, maybe.
I've got lots of time then. Well, thanks to all three of you for being here. 10 years or so ago, when I started talking about the demographic impact on food, which is highly predictable, and the doubling of world food need in a relatively short period of time. And I was talking to somebody who runs one of our big agricultural companies, and I say, can we do this? And his answer is, yes, we can do it, but we can't do it without science, and we can't do it without Africa. That incredible population growth in Africa, what all three of you are saying, the importance of Africa producing more of its own food and us helping figure out how to do that's critical. I do think at this moment, this immediate $5 billion, frankly, is going to go pretty fast and go fast to meet the crisis need. Governor, you said you bought Governor Beasley, you buy a lot of food from Ukraine. What happens as the Russians move across southern Ukraine? They've almost destroyed Mariupol, if not, and probably the port at Mariupol, I don't know, but they're now focusing on Odessa. What happens, one, to the rest of the world if those ports are not operational for some period of time? And then two, what do you think happens to Ukraine and the food they maybe would be able to still continue to grow if those ports aren't available to them or to anybody else, perhaps?
I guess you could actually say goodbye to Ukraine if you don't get those ports open, because the economy collapses. 40 or more percent of their GDP is based upon agricultural products that are exported through those ports. So it's critical. And then you talk about the impact that it'll have on global food security, famines around the world, the pricing that we're already seeing spiking. And so over the next 8 to 12 months, you'll see continued pricing spikes. And here's what's very frightening. When you look at Arab Spring in 2011, 2012, the economic indicators now are worse than they were in Arab Spring, because we see food pricing and what it leads to, from migration to riots to protests to destabilization. Just in the past few weeks, you've seen Sri Lanka, Indonesia, Pakistan, Peru. In the last few months, you saw Chad, of course, and Burkina Faso and Mali. And so it will only get worse in these places if food prices continue to spike, and they will, because you don't have the availability of $400 million. Ukraine feeds 400 million people with the food. So if that's out of the equation, where's that going to come from? You can't make that up that fast. So it creates tremendous market volatility. And then you compound that with the fertilizer problem. And like Ethiopia and Sudan, 85% of their fertilizer comes from Russia, Belarus. Mm-hmm. And they are already in very, very fragile states. That's just two, and I can go from country to.
But without those ports, could Ukraine, even if they could grow the food, how would they get the food? How would you get the food out of Ukraine?
You can't get enough food out. To try to truck it out, for example, when an average day at the ports is 3,000, give or take, train carloads per day, and the average train carload is 3 to 4 trucks. So do the math. That would be at least 10,000 trucks per day. And it's not a one-day trip. It's several days. So you could talk about 4 to 5 days worth of trucking operations, 50,000 trucks. What we have, in sitting down with the Ukrainian government, a best case scenario is you could truck and train out about 1 million metric tons a month. Now, the problem with that, and that's not much compared to how much they produce. It's a drop in the bucket. But the problem with that is pricing spikes with that, because the cost of transportation will move it up to $120 more per ton, which prices it out of the market.
Right. Let me ask one more question here. You said, and I think Ms. McKenna has also said, we need to move fast. What can we do to speed up our efforts through USAID? Are there tools we can better use to get this done quicker? And I want to go next to Ms. McKenna and ask her if the NGOs have the capacity to do more if we'll work in a better way. But David, you want to answer that?
Yeah, I do. I think there are several things. I think first and foremost, encouragement to USAID from the Senate and the House of move these funds quickly. I think they're under a lot of pressure. You got lawyers and all the bureaucracy, and I think as much encouragement as we can do down to USAID, that would be very important. Number two, in the past, we have mechanisms that we can put in place, that we have in place, ready to move quickly funds. I mean, cash-based transfer, we can move just like that. IRA accounts and major tranches for regional areas of the world, we can move these funds very quickly. We have the capacity to handle such, and then we can move funds with our partners as quickly as possible. But I think it's going to take a lot of encouragement down the street.
Ms. McKenna?
Yes, thank you for that question. We would encourage USAID to really work with NGOs to move quickly, obviously, but also really leveraging NGOs and leveraging existing relationships they have to do things like creating cash consortiums that can be used in multiple markets around the world, like Yemen or Syria, to kind of support local markets while also supporting food production and other things. So we saw them able to do that a bit with COVID, being able to top up existing awards to support that, and we would encourage them to look at that again.
Well, thank you, and I had a whole lot of other questions if the chairman hadn't returned, but he's back, and no, go right ahead, Chairman.
We have no other members currently seeking recognition, and I know we have 2 on their way back.
Well, from the African Bank point of view, what do we, again, the key points to, one, get food out quickly, and two, to encourage more production?
Thank you very much, Senator. In fact, back to your point you were saying earlier on was an excellent point on the importance of R&D. Science matters. And I just want to make two examples of that. One is in Africa today, we have actually supported what is called the water efficient maize for Africa, which is a very, very drought tolerant maize variety. Interestingly, I was at that time an associate director at the Rockefeller Foundation, and I was based in Zimbabwe when we actually supported the Global Center for Wheat and Maize Cement based in Mexico to develop those varieties. And those varieties worked when we had drought in East and Southern Africa in 2018, 2019. The African Development Bank, through this program that I mentioned to you called Technologies for African Agricultural Transformation, we actually got those water efficient maize varieties out to 5.2 million households. And that's why we were able to avoid a food crisis there. The second one is about wheat. As we all know, wheat is a temperate crop. But with technology right now, we actually have heat-tolerant wheat varieties. And the African Development Bank was able to provide the case that Beasley was talking about, the case of Sudan and also Ethiopia. We provided for Sudan, 65,000 metric tons of certified seed of these heat-tolerant varieties. And that is about the equivalent. If one takes an Airbus 380 in terms of passenger, cargo, and fuel, we have about 94 metric tons of 98.2 or so metric tons. So we're talking about almost 665 A380 Airbus of seed provided for that. And that allowed them to reduce their import of wheat. Most of you, of course, come from Russia and all of those places by 50%. We did the same also for Ethiopia, where today they were cultivating in 2018 to 5,000 hectares of heat-tolerant varieties. They've gone to 400,000 hectares of that today. So technology actually does matter. And in terms of, the issue of getting things out, I think, just to add to what Jada was saying, and also David, is I think that we should get it to what's working on the ground. Come back to what Senator Graham was saying, produce food in your backyard. And we have TAT, which actually brings together the global R&D centers, the national centers, the regional centers, the private R&D centers to actually get technologies to agricultural value chains all across Africa. So put the money what it is working on the ground. The plan that we have put forward here, distinguished senators, it's not one we develop in our offices. It's one that's actually developed from the countries, over 40 countries, where we have been impacting them in terms of access to climate resilient technologies. So one of the things we can do with this money, given also that the administration, U.S. administration is big on climate, as much as we are big on climate, is to make sure that the money is used for food, but also wins on climate. So we can win on food, but we also have to win on climate, and R&D is the best way. And we have the best way of getting these technologies out, I would say, is the mobile phones. We can register, we have to register farmers biometrically, give them access to technologies, and give them via their mobile phones, and send them money via mobile phones. That way we make sure there's inclusiveness, in particular that women have to be carried along. I continue to say that because you have to make sure that women participate and benefit from this because they are the majority. I've done this when I was Minister of Agriculture in Nigeria. We got all the farmers registered on mobile phones. We put them on digital databases, and we send them monies by vouchers on their mobile phones. And I remember walking into one perimeter one day. The farmer told me, the woman farmer there said, "Well, thank you, Minister. Now we get seeds and fertilizers in our villages, and the men cannot cheat us anymore." We've got to bring transparency and accountability and inclusiveness to the way in which these funds are deployed for impact.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Blunt, and thank you to my colleagues who have come to join this compelling hearing. I believe we will move next to Senator Murphy, then to Senator Moran, then to Senator Van Hollen, then to Senator Bozeman. I'm basing that on the order of when they were here before. We have another panel following this on COVID, which will be equally compelling. Senator Murphy.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for being here and for your fantastic work. I just wanted to have you all take a few minutes to delve a little bit deeper into the crisis in Afghanistan. This started as one of the world's poorest countries, and it has descended into what is really now the world's worst humanitarian crisis. And I'd like you all to give us a little bit of advice as to how we best unlock the significant amount of money that the United States currently has in its possession and at its disposal to try to address this crisis. In February, President Biden authorized $3.5 billion. That's about half of Afghanistan's frozen assets to be used, quote, for the benefit of the Afghan people. But 3 months later, we have not yet figured out what that international financing mechanism is. It still hasn't been set up. And so what advice would you give the administration? What advice would you suggest we give the administration as to how to push that $3.5 billion? Because it cannot be that we can't both save lives while also not unjustly enrich the Taliban. There is a mechanism by which to get this money as directly connected to the Afghan people as possible. So certainly start with you, Mr. Beasley, but I'd love comments from all three of our panelists.
Yeah. Senator Murphy, I mean, this is one of the things we've been talking about from the beginning because of the lack of funds that we have globally. And then when Afghanistan hit, we were already, right before Afghanistan, we were talking about the crisis that we're facing around the world. And Afghanistan hit, a nation of over 40 million people, 23 million people are an IPC 345. I mean, that's just unheard of. Give or take 7 million are knocking on famine's door. So we were like, look, we don't have enough money. So what we did with the World Bank, because the World Bank couldn't give it to the Taliban, and so we actually sat down with the Taliban and said, look, no one's going to give you money. Let it go directly to us without your fingerprints being on it. They, I would say, consented, but didn't matter. But it worked out with money came directly to us. Same thing on these frozen assets. I don't think there's any question whether it's us or UNICEF and others, that we can work with teachers, healthcare providers, and of course us working with beneficiaries throughout the country is not difficult to do. We're reaching about 14 million people right now, but because of the lack of funding, we're having to cut back, and at least try to reach those and knocking on famine's door. But we've got to unleash those funds, whatever it takes, because otherwise you either got to appropriate more dollars, and if you don't, you're going to have famine, you're going to have destabilization, which means you're going to have more migration coming out of Afghanistan, and you're going to have an extraordinary amount of recruitment by extremist groups for terrorist training activities.
Ms. McKenna?
Afghanistan is actually our largest, our longest continuous country presence. We have been operating in Afghanistan since the 1980s through multiple administrations. The government needs to figure out a mechanism to program that money to partners like us who are in those communities. That economy has collapsed. We've seen news accounts of families selling off young girls for dowry money because there's just no money coming in. Opium production is through the roof. We need to be able to start. We need to help save people from starvation.
But money coming directly to your programming does not enrich the
No.
Taliban in any way, shape, or form.
No, and we've been working with Treasury to create different rules and such so that we can program those funds.
Dr. Adesina?
I'll have to take a pass because my mandate doesn't cover Afghanistan.
All right, thank you all. Listen, this is long overdue. In a world in which we are starved for resources, here lies, for the time being, $3.5 billion that is ready to go. And you have pointed out that the programming you're running on the ground right now directly benefits the Afghan people without unjustly profiting the Taliban. You are not alone in that club. There are plenty of mechanisms that will allow us to do both, save lives and make sure that this money doesn't end up in the hands of the wrong people. And so my hope is that this committee can work with the administration to expedite a mechanism to get that money released. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Murphy. Senator Moran.
Chairman Coons, thank you. Thank you to our witnesses who care so much about this topic. I guess Ambassador Beasley, Governor Beasley, Yemen, it was talked about Afghanistan, a lot of unsavory individuals who control most of the populous parts of Yemen. How has the cooperation been with the Houthis, and what worries you with those countries going forward?
Senator, I've had some very frank conversations with the Houthis. I was just there a month and a half ago meeting with the Houthi leadership. And I know you probably recall back when I was pretty tough on the coalition about the blockade in Haditha. And really was, in fact, 60 Minutes did a story then that helped break up the issue of the blockade in Haditha because we couldn't get food supplies in. And that's a country that relies on 90%, 85-90% of all its food comes from the outside. And so when I was pretty hard on the coalition, and that broke apart in terms of allowing the blockade to be set aside and food came in, the Houthis were just so excited and patting me on the back. Thank you, you're our friend. I said, look, I'm not doing this because I'm on your side. I'm doing this because it's the right thing to do. And I said, and if you cross that line too, I probably shouldn't say what I said to them here, but anyway, the bottom line, I said, I'm going to kick your rear end too, that kind of thing. And they kind of laughed about it. Well, a couple years later, we had some serious issues with regards to many of our provisions in place to move food out there and neutral impartiality to reach the beneficiaries with independence. We had significant issues. So I went and sat down with them and said, let me be very clear. We don't have enough money right now to feed everybody in the world. And our donors want to make certain that every dollar is maximized to reach the most people possible. And so when what you're doing in diverting our aid and creating all these unnecessary obstacles, there's no way that we can get the funding we need to help the people in Yemen. And we want to be able to do it in a neutral, impartial, independent way. I actually made the decision to cut off all food supplies for about 1 million people for about a month. It was a hard decision, but with diversion taking place, otherwise I'd be participating in diverting food from innocent children over here to help, and this is where we're facing today. We're having to take, for lack of money, food from hungry children to give to starving children. That's horrible. So it was quite remarkable. The Houthis didn't think there was anyone in the United Nations, I think, would actually do that. We made that hard decision, and they were at the table within a few weeks, and we resolved it, and things have moved incredibly better since then. That doesn't mean it's all perfect. Anytime you're dealing with these types of places, it's tough, but the cooperation has remarkably improved inside Yemen. But there's still a lot of issues there.
Is there attention being paid, and this, perhaps it's to you again, Governor, attention being paid to the countries that are enacting protectionist policies to keep the food they grow within their country? And is there something that you, the United States of America, the United Nations need to be doing to encourage it? It drives up the cost and makes it more difficult for us to meet the needs of hungry people elsewhere.
We faced this in COVID in a remarkable way. A lot of ministers of different governments, of economies and trade were doing lockdowns, shutdowns, border controls, limitations on import-exports, and it was creating havoc. So I was on the phone, particularly those first 6 months, and my teams were on the phone saying, let me explain to you what's going to happen. You shut down this port right now, or you put this limitation at this stage. Here's what's going to happen the next 3-6 months. And so we were able to really avert a lot of the complications from those types of restrictions. Now we're seeing that bubbling again. And I think not just us, but everywhere we see it, we try to make a phone call, explain, please don't do this, here's what's going to happen, talking to the Secretary General and others in the United Nations, as well as talking to our friends like in the United States to say, please call this particular government leader to minimize these types of issues. And so that's one of the
actions are being taken.
Actions are being taken, but you got to be on top of it literally every day.
Let me quickly, in the last minute or so, raise the topic of ready-to-use therapeutic food, RUTF. 2 countries, I think, South Sudan and Ethiopia, have already requested RUTF through the Bill Emerson Humanitarian Trust. Do you support including funding for RUTF via the Bill Emerson Trust, the Emergency Supplemental Package, or annual appropriations to ensure that this life-saving product gets into the hands of those who need it most?
Yes, sir. The Emerson Trust is a godsend right now with the crisis that we're facing. If you don't use it now, I don't know when you would use it. And so we're 100% supportive.
Thank you. Ms. McKinney, anything to add? Or
No, nothing to add.
Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Moran. Senator Van Hollen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to all of our witnesses. Mr. Beasley, it's good to see you today. We were together yesterday morning talking about some of these issues, and thank you for all your passion and experience you bring to these critical matters. Yesterday, I was able to bring you the preliminary good news that we were on the verge of passing the $40 billion assistance package, including $5 billion for food security assistance. And I do want to thank the chairman of our subcommittee for all his work making that happen. And I'm confident that I'm increasingly confident we'll have bipartisan support here. I want to get to how the $5 billion will help the emergency food situation around the world. But before that, I have a question about Odessa and the Russian ports. And I know it was covered a little bit already, but if you could dig down more deeply on what will happen to food insecurity around the world if we don't unblock those ports. There's some people saying, well, we can use the land routes, and obviously we want to do our best. But Mr. Beasley, tell us what will happen if that, I think it's over 30 million tons of wheat is stuck in those Ukrainian ports. What does that mean for world hunger?
Ukraine normally ships about 60 million metric tons through those ports on an annualized basis. That's about 3,000 train carloads per day. You can't truck enough out. You can't do it. You can truck out about 1 million metric tons a month on a good day at best. And even then, you're talking about $120 more per metric ton. So it puts it out of the market in terms of pricing. And so the port's got to open. Ukraine grows enough food to feed 400 million people. It's not just availability of food pricing. It's also food pricing. That is going to do more harm to the poorest of the poor around the world who barely can afford now. As I was saying earlier, we've gone from 80 million people marching to starvation to 276 right before Ukraine, and now that number is going to go up an additional 50 million. So number one, the Ukraine economy, over 40% is export. Over 40% is agricultural exports. So it will have catastrophic consequences if another shot's not fired in the war and the ports are just blocked. Yeah. I don't know how. I mean, I'm not the economist here. I'm just a humanitarian, but I don't know how you don't have economic collapse. Then you have the impact inside Ukraine. Then you have the agricultural impact on food supplies, particularly in Eastern Africa, Western Africa, the Sahel, countries that depend on this grain from this region. For example, Egypt, 85% dependency. Lebanon, 80%. 26 countries depend upon Ukraine, Russia over 50%. And we buy over 50% from Ukraine itself. We assist about 125 million people any given day, week, or month. So, yeah. And it's already having a $71 million increase of operational costs per month on our operations, which means we will feed 4 million people less.
Yeah.
As we speak right now.
I appreciate you going into that. So I wanted to paint a clear picture of what the consequences here. I think the world, at least outside of Russia, knows that Putin's killing people indiscriminately in Ukraine. But countries around the world need to recognize that what he's doing in Ukraine and the blocking of the ports are going to result in starvation and food insecurity for tens of millions of people around the world. Do you know of any ongoing efforts to address this issue? And I don't mean those of us who are calling for something to happen. I mean any material progress in this.
Senator, I know, as you know, I've made requests straight to President Putin that the world's famines are in your hands right now, and you need to open up these ports. I do believe there are efforts being made as we sit to try to create an opportunity to open up the ports. And it can't just be an opening of the ports for humanitarian purposes, because the commercial side is just as equally on a humanitarian basis. And we cannot food can't be weaponized. Yeah. It just cannot. And right now, if those ports stay closed, food would be weaponized.
Let me, in my remaining time here, first associate myself with the comments of Senator Murphy with respect to Afghanistan and the situation there. I think, as he indicated, we can find a way to help people without in any way strengthening or reinforcing the Taliban government. Thank you for the efforts you made in Yemen. That remains a really terrible situation, but your efforts improved it. And my final seconds here, maybe if I could just get a sense of the $5 billion, maybe Ms. McKenna, you could tell me, what will that mean for your efforts around the world if we're able to get the $5 billion for food assistance?
The $5 billion, a chunk of it obviously will go to emergency food relief, and we expect that through our colleagues at the World Food Program. But what's really important is that we have a chunk of it that really goes towards long-term resilience and building long-term systems so that these economies can support themselves and that they can further withstand the shocks that are to come with climate change, drought, and conflict. So that's things like supporting farmers long-term, using cash and vouchers and things to support local markets, incorporating youth into activities, and really working with conflict actors. May I add one other point, kind of based on your prior question? Russia is using hunger as a weapon of war, and Congress is on record kind of condemning the use of hunger as a weapon of war through the recently introduced House Resolution 922, and we hope that the Senate will take up a companion version of that as well.
You were
looking at comments, Senator Holland.
Oh, yeah, I'll go ahead, but let me. Yeah,
Akeem.
Yeah, right here on the video. Yeah. Well, just on that point, the Senator, on the what will this mean? In the case of Africa, I think we need to really focus on what the problems are. You know, for Africa right now, it's not just giving food away, it's actually producing food, because we're dealing with a very massive food price inflation. And at the market level, to bring that down, it has to be something that is structural, that is scalable, and that is sustainable. And that's why we have the African Emergency Food Production Plan to actually produce that food. And that's going to, with the $5 billion, you know, we have put $1.3 billion of our own money on the line. We're putting our money where our mouths are, you know, and we need $200 million to be able to come up to the $1.5 billion that we want to be able to help Africa to avoid a looming food crisis. What this will do, the $1.5 billion, if we're able to get $200 million from the U.S. government to complement $1.3 billion that we are putting down ourselves, it will allow us to get climate resilient agricultural technologies to 20 million farmers in Africa. It will allow them to produce 38 million metric tons of food. And the big part of that will be 11 million metric tons of that will be wheat. I just mentioned our experience in Sudan and also in Ethiopia. We'll have 18 million metric tons of corn, and we're looking at 6 million metric tons of soybean rice, and 2.5 million metric tons of soybean. So it will make a lot of impact. But we need to also use this crisis to deal with the structural issues to unlock agricultural potential in Africa. And from the African Development Bank, we have a program that we are also going to see as a relay, basically from this emergency production program that we are calling 1 for 200, Mission 1 for 200, which is to allow support African countries to produce an additional 100 million metric tons of food that will feed 200 million people. If we are able to feed 200 million people, that means that we can actually cut hunger in Africa by 80%. I've been agricultural literally all my life. I've never been this confident that we can actually reach zero hunger. But it will have to be done via structural approach, not just simply giving food away.
Thank you. Thank you for emphasizing that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Van Hollen. Senator Bozeman, for the last questioner of this round. We do still have three great witnesses for a second panel and about half an hour left.
Thank you, and I'll be brief because I know we need to move on. We appreciate all of you being here, and we appreciate the great work that you do. Governor Beasley, congratulations on your Nobel Prize. You and your agency, that is remarkable, and we are very, very proud of you. U.S. is a very generous country, and it's really stepped up in the past, is stepping up now. Tell us about that. Tell us about what that means, and then also how does that help you when you're dealing with other countries to pony up the way that they should?
When I arrived, the United States was appropriating about $1.8 to $1.9 billion. And we had many of us in this room had a conversation out of concern that this new Republican administration with Trump would zero out the budget and we would have significant funding problems. And all of us came together. It was quite remarkable to see everybody come together, and actually on both ends of Pennsylvania Avenue on this particular issue. And so our funding went from $1.8 billion to $3.84 billion. And like I was saying earlier, my goal was to put the World Food Program out of business. Funding would go down. But because of crisis after crisis, war after war, climate shocks, and now Ukraine, Afghanistan, Ethiopia, the needs have gone up substantially. So the United States has led the way. And I've been able to use that when I go to Germany, the colleagues in the Bundestag or in the UK Parliament or the Nordic countries, the EU, and say, look, the United States is stepping up, because usually the first line of impact is in Europe. Now, Central America is first line of impact is the United States. But because of what the United States has done, and Germany and a few other major donors, we, particularly during COVID, because not many people realize the economic ripple effect that COVID had on the poorest of the poor countries around the world. Had it not been for the United States, the taxpayers of this country, we would have had mass famine. We would have had destabilization of many nations, and we would have had mass migration. We were able to avert that in the last couple of years because of the generosity of the American taxpayer, along with Germany and other donors. So here we are again, unfortunately, because COVID recycled, and now with Ukraine, we've got a crisis within a crisis, that perfect storm. And so this appropriation right now, as I'm sure I get some of my friends in South Carolina, why should I send money down there, you know? And I'm like, well, if you don't, it's going to cost you 1,000 times more. I don't say that hypothetically, theoretically. Our experiential data proves very clearly when we have strategic international aid and food security, it saves taxpayers anywhere from $100 to $1,000 more, 1,000 times more. So thank you, sir.
So no, and again, we've got all of this going on. I'm very active in agriculture right now. The increase in fertilizer costs, the input costs are just through the roof. Part of that being, fertilizer from Belarus and Russia and areas, other countries seeing this are actually holding their fertilizer. So we got the input cost problem. We got the high cost of diesel. So as you mentioned earlier, we're going to have, tremendous commodity increases. So these countries aren't going to be able to buy as much. And then the other problem is, Senator Van Hollen mentioned the importance of opening the ports and all that. Even if that's done, high commodity prices, because of the high inputs, and then what I'd like for you to talk about is the potential. Even if we do ports, do all we can, are we looking at shortages? How do we plan? What do you need for us to do? And it's not, with shortages, it's not money. What do we do to coordinate to make it such that we're proactive and see this coming, and people like you help us plan as we go into the future? Senator,
before Ukraine, I was already declaring to the world we were facing the worst humanitarian crisis for the year 2022 that we'd ever seen since World War II. And just when you think it couldn't get any worse, then Ukraine, the breadbasket of the world, a nation that feeds 400 million people. Right. And so you were seeing fuel costs, shipping costs just escalate beyond the roof. Food pricing on commodities was already doubling and tripling in many of the poorest of the poor countries. And so it was already a problem. Then Ukraine comes into the scene. So what is critical is to get those ports operational for a variety of reasons. It will not eliminate the problems. It will at least diminish some of the excesses of the problems we're going to face. Because right now, when you look at the droughts taking place around the world, even in the United States, and then you get the Horn of Africa and other places in Central Asia, for example, you're talking about a dynamic impact on food production. Compound that with the fertilizer problem. Countries are not able to get the fertilizers, or the cost is so high they can't afford it. So smallholder farmers can't afford it. We're already hearing farmers say they can't afford the fertilizers. They're going to be cutting back on production. And this is not the time we need that. So when I talked with about 4 weeks ago, the Foreign Affairs Minister for France who called me, and when I went through this scenario, what we were looking at, he literally was just shocked. And we get together the G7 agricultural ministers, Tom Vilsack, and all of us had a very practical conversation. And I said, let me tell you what we're facing. The question to you is how quickly can you react in the major producing countries to offset not just Ukraine, but the crisis that we're facing around the world, from the lands that have been set aside to fertilizers, and which has been interesting because like the Green Party in Europe and in Germany have been very, very open and pragmatic at this stage, which is, it's good to see everybody coming together to understand that we truly have a global crisis coming before us. And so the next 8 to 12 months, we'll have a food pricing problem. And I think in the spring and the fall of next year, we could have a food availability problem.
Very good. Thank you. Thank you to all the witnesses.
Senator Boozman, can I make a point on the fertilizer question?
Yes.
Thank you. Just on that fertilizer question, as I said in my remarks at the start, that Africa faces 2 million metric tons of shortage. And if we don't actually very quickly close that, it means that even productivity on existing arable land will decline by anything between 20% to 50%. Just to let you know, concrete actions that are actually being taken on that. I've called for a meeting of all the global CEOs of fertilizer companies. And that meeting is actually tomorrow, to really look into how is it that we make sure that Africa is not shortchanged this time around. And we know what happened with regard to the COVID-19 issue with vaccines. We want to make sure that Africa's priorities are not at the end, that all the rich countries of the world then take over all the fertilizers, and then of course then we have a problem. So ammonia phosphate are the main issues. So we're trying to see how we can actually deal with some of this issue. Now the point on the price, I think, of fertilizer. I'm right here in Ghana. I'm not based in Ghana, but just came here to see the president as we are preparing for the annual meetings of the African Development Bank that is holding here in Accra. But I was surprised with the price of fertilizers here. The price of fertilizer has gone up from about 65 Ghanaian cedis per 25 kg bag, to roughly on the open market, parallel market, to about almost 220. You can imagine what this will do. So it's a big issue. If we don't solve the fertilizer problem, we cannot solve the food problem. And one of the things I want to suggest to the distinguished members of the Senate committee is that the issue of trade finance is going to play a very, very important role. And secondly is guarantee facilities are going to be very important to make sure that financial institutions can actually lend to the fertilizer importers and wholesalers and the retailers to actually get it out to the end. And in particular also, maybe I link it back to the original point raised by one of the senators on efficiency of the use of the $5 billion. We've got to make sure also that we deal with delivery risks, because if we look at the price of fertilizers as high as it is, there's no doubt we're going to have to subsidize. But if we have to subsidize, we have to then make sure that the subsidies are done in a way that are market friendly, in a way that's well targeted, in a way that actually uses digital technologies to reach the farmers that need it. And in fact, I actually don't so much even like the word subsidy. I like to call it growth enhancement support, which is we give people what they need to boost their production and very quickly transition that to a more market-based system. So these, I think, are very important if we are going to actually have to deal with this. But this fertilizer question, it's very important. And we actually have a global meeting on that tomorrow.
Right. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Boozman. Thank you, Dr. Adesina. I remember well our visit in Abidjan, and I appreciate your insightful testimony today. Ms. McKenna, thank you, and thank you for everything Mercy Corps does around the world. And I thank David Beasley and the World Food Program. We're now going to quickly transition to the second panel. We are awaiting notification of when the next vote will be. A number of the members of the committee are waiting for that next vote, but I think we should proceed with this second panel. I want to thank the witnesses for our second panel today that will focus on the COVID-19 pandemic and in particular its global impacts and what investments the United States should be making to address the current status and future risks associated with this and other potential pandemics. We have three remarkable witnesses, physicians with extensive experience in responding to infectious disease outbreaks. Dr. Tom Frieden is former director of the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention and currently serves as president of Resolve to Save Lives. Dr. Atul Gawande is the assistant administrator for global health at the U.S. Agency for International Development. And speaking with us remotely today is Dr. Michael Ryan, executive director of the World Health Organization's Health Emergencies Program, who will be joining us remotely from Geneva. This second panel is a briefing of the subcommittee for some technical reasons relating to the World Health Organization, but it's important that I recognize that. Dr. Frieden, if you'd please start us off, and if there is a vote that interrupts us, I will inform you, but thank you for your testimony. If you can keep it concise, that will allow us to have more of a discussion, but I appreciate your testimony and your patience with the first panel and the enthusiasm of our members.
Thank you very much, Chairman Coons and Ranking Member and distinguished members of the committee for the opportunity to testify today. Here's the bottom line. The U.S. and the world were underprepared for COVID, haven't responded well, and we're well on our way to making the deadly mistake of repeating the cycle of panic and neglect. This would leave us avoidably vulnerable, not only to future COVID variants, but also to future health threats. I urge Congress to approve the proposed COVID supplemental request at least the $5 billion for global COVID control, with funding to both USAID and CDC. Most of the 1 million deaths that the U.S. has suffered and most of the nearly 20 million deaths that the world have suffered did not have to happen. Pandemics do not stop because of wars. In fact, wars tend to accelerate pandemics. That's certainly what happened 100 years ago. With safe and effective vaccines, as well as stunningly effective treatment, we can have the upper hand on COVID in this country. However, this is only true as long as a worse variant doesn't emerge. We have to face three dichotomies, and in each of these there's a pull toward one side that would imbalance our response. The first dichotomy is the temptation to spend money on stuff, vaccines, equipment, medications, while neglecting the need for staff. To increase vaccination uptake, you need healthcare workers. You need to focus on vaccinating healthcare workers as well as the elderly and immunosuppressed people who are not only most likely to die, but perhaps most likely to have the emergence of variants if they are infected. We have to support staff on the ground who can do this, and I will say that in Sierra Leone, my organization, Resolve to Save Lives, worked with one of the organizations implementing the tremendous success story of PEPFAR, a bipartisan program. We approached more than 7,000 healthcare workers because healthcare workers getting vaccinated is a critical first step to change the narrative on vaccinations in many countries. 2% declined vaccination. 90% were double vaccinated, 8% got a single dose. The second dichotomy is the need to focus on both response and prevention. It's tempting to focus on putting the fire out, but we have to make our world more resistant to future outbreaks. This is why it's essential to have at least the $5 billion previously requested for the Global Health Appropriations Supplemental. I also strongly support the FY23 budget proposal of $88.2 billion over 5 years to allow sustained targeted interventions and investments in public health and preparedness domestically and around the world, including to support both CDC and USAID for global protection. The third dichotomy is protecting the U.S. versus recognizing that it's in our self-interest to support programs to fight COVID and other threats around the world. The plain truth is that it saves more lives and costs less money to fight outbreaks at their source than fighting them on our shores. When it comes to access to vaccines and treatment, the right thing to do ethically is also the right thing to do epidemiologically, but that's going to require more money from the U.S. and from other countries. The CDC plays a critical role around the world in vaccine planning and implementation, vaccine safety monitoring, supporting ministries of health. CDC has over 1,000 doctors and other public health specialists who know how to plan vaccine campaigns, support countries, assess and improve vaccine administration. Both USAID and CDC have indicated that they will no longer be able to continue this work unless Congress approves additional funding. This funding was cut, unfortunately, from the recent bipartisan supplemental deal framework. I urge you to find a way through to provide support for global COVID control. Representative Tom Cole of Oklahoma said at the start of this epidemic, it's just a no-brainer to spend billions on preparedness to save trillions of dollars in costs. He also predicted years before COVID hit that Americans are much more likely to be killed by a pandemic than by a terrorist. He was right then, and he's right today. COVID has claimed more than 1 million American lives. That's more than any and all wars over the past 150 years. And yet, we spend only about 300 times to 500 times less on our health defense than we do on our military defense. We have to address COVID now, be ready for the next variant, and protect against future threats. Fiscal responsibility certainly includes cutting direct costs when appropriate. But fiscal responsibility also requires making sound investments to save money and save lives. We can't afford not to spend the $5 billion, and ideally more, to protect the world and protect ourselves through increasing global vaccination. We have to be better prepared for the next threat, and that's why the FY23 proposal is so very important. This really is the make or break year. This is the world's teachable moment to prevent the next pandemic. You in Congress have the power to provide the essential investments to make this possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Frieden. Dr. Gawande.
Thank you. Chairman Coons. Here we go. Chairman Coons, Ranking Member Graham, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the invitation to speak today. I lead Global Health at USAID, and I get to co-chair our COVID-19 task force. My written testimony I put into the record, so I'm just going to try to hit a few of the high points for you. The direct and indirect impacts of this pandemic have been horrendous. The result is the first reduction in global life expectancy in a century. It's development in reverse. If it weren't for the bipartisan support that you in Congress and American taxpayers have provided, these numbers would be far worse. The government, U.S. government, is providing more than $19 billion in assistance towards the fight against COVID-19. Of this, USAID has deployed almost $10 billion. And through the President's Global COVID-19 Summit last year, and the second one, which will take place tomorrow, we have also rallied the world to join this fight. And in the course of this, we have accomplished a lot. We've donated more than 500 million COVID-19 doses to 115 countries in just 9 months. That is a historic accomplishment. We launched the Global Vax effort to ensure that we're able to get shots into arms with $1.7 billion in committed funding. And USAID is also leading the non-vaccine work, where we've become the global leader in providing oxygen systems, as well as testing and treatment supplies. But here we are. We are now at a precipice. As of the 1st of May, we have approved and or notified 99.9% of the total COVID-19 supplemental funds that we've received. And we have obligated 95% of those funds. When it comes to the American Rescue Plan Act funds, we've obligated 90% of that. We expect to obligate virtually all remaining supplemental funds by July. Our work at that point will begin grinding to a halt. And it is clear that the fight against COVID is not done. I just want to say the worst may not be behind us. I want us to understand that. The potential outcome scenarios that we face are extremely wide. I'm a cancer surgeon, and I tell my patients that we will hope for the best, but hope is not a plan. Of more than 10 billion vaccine doses administered worldwide, only 1% has been administered in low-income countries. We have barely more than 16% of people across Africa fully vaccinated. Lower-income countries face even bigger gaps in access to the arsenal that we now have been able to count on. That is, they barely have access to rapid diagnostic tests, to oxygen capacity, and now the new generation of oral antiviral pills that have proven to be so effective. And that's why the administration requested $5 billion to support the immediate needs of the global COVID-19 response. That includes $2.55 billion to enable an expansion of global vax to get more shots into arms in under-vaccinated countries. I'll point out it requested no money, not a dime, for new vaccines because we're in a situation of vaccine abundance. We had $1.7 billion in request, however, to enable us to shrink the gaps in global access to testing, oxygen capacity, and antiviral treatments. And then finally, we've requested $750 million to enable humanitarian assistance. As you heard from the prior panel, COVID-19 has complicated humanitarian assistance in a number of domains, made disasters worse, in particular increasing food insecurity. We're now facing the cost, potentially, of inaction. If no further funds are appropriated, we will have to end our leadership in increasing vaccinations. We will have to give up on fighting dangerous variants, even though each surge of variants has disrupted our supply chains, disrupted the trade we rely on, and driven inflationary pressures that are hurting every American. These recurrent cycles of damage have endangered and continue to endanger the health and lives of all Americans, as well as people around the world. So I want to emphasize here, stopping global COVID-19 funding would be a geopolitical mistake. It would be an ethical mistake. It would be a health security mistake, and it would be an economic mistake of historic proportions. Throughout the pandemic, you in Congress have done what has had to be done and passed supplemental funding that has saved the lives of millions abroad and protected hundreds of millions here at home. And once again, we are asking you to please come together to continue America's leadership to end the acute phase of this pandemic. I'm grateful for this opportunity to be here today. I welcome any questions.
Thank you, Dr. Gawande. Dr. Ryan.
Good afternoon, Chairman Coons, Ranking Member Graham, distinguished members of the subcommittee. Thank you so much for the opportunity to speak with you today. As agreed, this will be an informal technical briefing. I am Executive Director of the Health Emergencies Program here at WHO, and for over 25 years I have worked on the front line in epidemics, conflicts, and natural disasters all over the world. I've just returned from Ukraine. Where I saw firsthand the work of frontline health workers and witnessed the power of resilience in the face of horror. This is the same resilience, compassion, and dedication that we have and continue to witness in our frontline workers around the world against COVID-19, in their determination to protect communities, save lives, and deliver to the last mile. COVID-19 has infected billions and killed millions. However, every single person on the planet has been impacted by this virus, with health weakened, loved ones lost, futures stolen, and livelihoods destroyed. This virus has ripped through our communities like a tornado, and like that tornado remains highly unpredictable in its course and its intensity. While global reported cases are declining, the virus continues to evolve and evade, leaving our interlinked communities highly vulnerable everywhere, especially in areas with low vaccination. High rates of people with underlying conditions and limited access to health systems. Continued major disruptions in vital programs for HIV/AIDS, malaria, tuberculosis, maternal health and immunization, and others threaten decades of progress. Intense circulation of this virus has resulted in many variants of concern, each more transmissible than the last. All these variants have emerged outside the United States and all have reached the United States. Yet, testing, sequencing, and surveillance activities in many countries are falling blinding us to potentially dangerous new variants. However, in a world of intractable problems, COVID-19 has solutions. This is thanks to the scientists who have developed life-saving interventions and the public health and frontline workers who have delivered them. This is in great part due to the leadership of the United States and other countries supporting a global effort led by WHO and its partners. But massive disparities in access to vaccines, antivirals, oxygen, and other life-saving tools and interventions threatens to undermine all we have achieved in the fight against COVID. While almost 12 billion doses of COVID vaccines have been administered around the world, nearly 1 billion people in lower income countries have not received a single dose of vaccine against COVID. That number includes more than 2/3 of healthcare workers and older persons in those countries. We can end this emergency phase of the pandemic, but we will not do so unless we deliver these life-saving interventions to everyone, everywhere. This will not happen with vaccines alone. It also requires surveillance, testing and sequencing, protective gear and therapeutics, and most of all, effective community engagement and empowerment. It requires that all of these are delivered to the last mile and administered by well-trained and equipped workers. The funding you are considering today is critical to help us to get these life-saving tools to the people that need them most everywhere. WHO's Strategic Preparedness, Readiness and Response Plan details how to achieve this, but remains underfunded by $1 billion. WHO also coordinates the Access to COVID Tools, or ACT Accelerator, and is shipping millions of vaccines, test kits, and therapeutics to lower-income countries. The ACT's COVAX pillar has delivered 1.42 billion vaccine doses so far, 80% of the supply to low-income countries so far. However, the ACT-A is facing a nearly 15 billion funding gap. This money is needed to purchase over 700 million tests, treatments for 120 million patients, protective equipment for 1.7 million health workers, and 600 million doses of vaccine. In summary, Senators, as long as this virus is circulating widely anywhere in the world, we are all at risk. We have to act now to save lives and enable the global economy to get back on track. We need to track this virus. We need to vaccinate the world. We need to diagnose and treat patients quickly and early, and we need to communicate with and engage our communities deeply. We need scaled up investment in the solutions that are so badly needed to end this pandemic. The world has long looked to the US for global health leadership. It was nearly 20 years ago that the EU introduced the PEPFAR program, a bipartisan effort which saved the lives of 20 million people from AIDS. Today, the leadership of the United States is more vital than ever. The funding you are considering today will be a major contribution towards ending the acute phase of this pandemic and making the world prepared for the next global threat. Thank you, sirs.
Thank you, Doctor. Thank you, all three of you, for your testimony. If you might, you used particularly pointed, unsettling, difficult, and memorable phrases about our being avoidably vulnerable, about the balance between stuff and staff, about this being a tornado whose course and intensity we cannot predict. Let me just first ask of all three of you, if I might. It's a compound question, but what is the risk of the development of a variant that is more deadly as well as more transmissive than what we've seen so far? I am struggling with my colleagues. One of them said to me memorably, my constituents are done with this pandemic. And I said, sir, with all due respect, this pandemic is not done with your constituents. One of our real challenges is one of imagination. Most Americans and many senators don't appreciate that as long as there are billions who are unvaccinated and whose public health systems in the countries they inhabit are fragile, and where testing and monitoring is dropping rapidly, the risk of a new variant emerging that is more deadly and that can get around the vaccine protection we've already deployed, I think is significant. But I'd be interested in hearing from all three of you whether there is any real risk of this. First. Second, the timing of money matters. We failed to deliver $5 billion when requested months ago. We failed to get it on to the Ukraine supplemental, likely to pass tomorrow. I don't see what the timing is or the path forward on getting the international COVID relief funded through this committee and through this Congress. I will try. I raise it every day. I press it with leadership, with my caucus and the other caucus. What difference does it make if we deliver this $5 billion this month next month, or not until the fall? What would the consequences be domestically and globally? And last, what do you think is the right balance between staff and stuff, between making sure that we are investing in public health system personnel and resources, as opposed to delivering more therapeutics, delivering more testing, delivering more vaccines? What's the right balance? If each of the three of you in turn would answer those questions, I'd really appreciate it. Dr. Frieden?
Thank you very much. The Nobel laureate Josh Lederberg used to say that microbes outnumber us millions, billions, or trillions to one. Our only hope is to outsmart them. The risk of a variant that's deadlier than the Delta variant and just as or more infectious than Omicron is absolutely present, but it's not inevitable, and it's not something that we can't do something about. Unlike perhaps a tornado, we are able to reduce the risk by tamping down spread, particularly in areas of vulnerability and where there are people with immunosuppression, which is one theory of how some of the more dangerous variants have emerged. No one can tell you with certainty that it may or may not occur or when it may occur. It could have already occurred. It might not happen for a month, a year, or 5 years. There is no inevitability about various variants becoming less vicious. There is an inevitability that variants that are able to spread better do spread more. And those that have begun spreading in one area may spread more in that area. But the virus is only rewarded, if you will, if it spreads faster, whether that is a devastating variant that causes a high fatality rate, or, as Omicron may be, somewhat less deadly, particularly for people with immunity from either prior vaccination or prior infection. What we are seeing with the new Omicron variants is increasingly the virus is learning about our immune systems and learning to get around our immunity, either from prior infection or from vaccination. And that's why it's so important that we get these first-generation vaccines out as quickly as possible and continue to develop second-generation vaccines and make sure that if and when we do have better, broader, longer-lasting vaccines that may be able to address vaccine escape variants, they're available to the world promptly after they become available, so we don't have a repeat of what happened this time around. In terms of the timing, better late than never. The sooner the better, but every month that goes by, we have a greater chance of unchecked spread leading to a more dangerous variant. And in terms of the balance of stuff versus staff, I think the maybe one way to think about that is to think about the minimum necessary for staff and to protect or ring fence those fundamental systems. You need systems to detect problems when they first occur. So you need a laboratory network, you need a surveillance and monitoring system. You also need rapid response capacity so that the public health staff can go out and investigate outbreaks when they occur. There are great new tools. I really am very excited about them. Genomics, artificial intelligence, machine learning, but none of them are shortcuts to building a system where someone who feels sick goes to their local health provider, the local health provider contacts the public health department, there's a prompt and effective investigation and a prompt and effective response. In fact, that's what we've promoted with our approach for rapid diagnosis and rapid response.
I apologize. My staff is telling me that we are down to very few senators who have not voted, and the floor is waiting for me. If I could ask each of the two remaining witnesses about 3 minutes in answering my question. Are there any staff who are aware of any senator who is seeking to come back? In the absence of that, I'm going to ask for the two remaining witnesses to speak, and then I'm going to close the hearing and return to cast my vote on this. If you would, please, Dr. Gawande. And thank you to all three of you for really compelling written testimony and in-person testimony. I will berate my colleagues for their attendance on the floor rather than here.
I'll say quickly. The risk of development of a more deadly disease, WHO laid out the best case scenario, the base case scenario, and the worst case scenario. The best case scenario is that we continue to have what we have had thus far, which is a contagious, relatively milder form of the variants that remain amenable to vaccine effectiveness. However, evasion of vaccine effectiveness or being more deadly is absolutely a potential outcome. And so we have to be prepared for the worst case scenario, much as we don't want to think about it. It's just the reality of what we should be preparing to do. Time really matters. We already see now that production lines for testing is not unlike before Delta last time. That basically we're at some of the lowest levels of rapid test production that we've seen. We have low levels of production on PPE and masks because the demand for these things have disappeared, and that is going to cost us. So that if we wait, we are not seeding that those supply lines. We're not keeping them. We're not keeping the workers in place, and so it will be weeks to months to get them back online. Then add in the antivirals. If we don't have advanced market commitments to get production of the new oral antivirals that so protect us, that is our safeguard, so that if a virus develops, a variant develops that evades the vaccines, then we have the oral antivirals to work with. But if production is not happening for the world, we will find our own country is behind. Finally, on staff and stuff, what I would say is that we've been very good about buying stuff. It's easier to move out quickly. It's easier to buy. But when it comes to making these services happen, whether it's oxygen, whether it's antivirals or vaccines, making it possible for, in the United States and abroad, having more commitment to the staff so that we are getting the mobile units out to do the vaccinations or do the treatment or enable the systems to get into place. That's what makes these lasting systems. And those systems are helping us not only for the next variant, it's for the next possible outbreak, it's for addressing childhood pneumonia, making safer birth. It makes for a better system of care.
Thank you, Dr. Gawande. Dr. Ryan, and Dr. Gawande, I am going to want to follow up with you about the therapeutic procurement, in particular, something Senator Murray has been relentlessly pressing our caucus about. Dr. Ryan, you're going to get the last word today.
Thank you, Senator. In terms of will more transmissible variants emerge, they are emerging as we speak. They're emerging on almost monthly basis. This is a non-random effect. This is pressure on the virus through transmission and survival. Whether more virulent or more dangerous, more lethal variants emerge is very much it's a random effect. It can happen. It can happen instantly, or it may never happen. It's very hard to quantify that risk. But if we leave millions of people getting infected who are not getting well quickly, people with immunosuppression, underlying conditions, with long-standing infections that we don't either prevent or treat early, those people produce quantums more virus, because the virus stays in the individual human body for longer and can produce more and more variants, and those variants become much, much more dangerous. In terms of timing, I've said it before, perfection is the enemy of the good when you are dealing with epidemics. Speed beats perfection. Speed is what we need. We need to act now. We need to reduce the number of people on this planet who are being infected. We need to reduce the number of people who have long-standing severe clinical infections who can produce variants that can run on to infect others and potentially evade our vaccines. And in terms of staff versus stuff, we have a big focus on commodities, but to protect communities and to save lives, it has, as it has always been, we need frontline health workers, frontline community workers, frontline NGOs, frontline people in the system who can deliver the solutions that we develop upstream. Just having stuff without the staff makes no difference in the world, Senator. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ryan. Thank you, Dr. Gawande. Thank you, Dr. Frieden. I am grateful for your testimony today, for your long service to protecting the world and the American people and advancing public health. We will keep this record open for a week until 5 p.m. On Wednesday, May 18th, and I look forward to working tirelessly with each of you and with my colleagues to ensure that we do, in fact, advance this desperately needed appropriation to ensure that the world is safer from this pandemic, and I look forward to working with you on preparations for the next. Thank you, and with that, this hearing is concluded.